I'm going to ask a couple of very quick questions, and if you can just respond, I mean, you don't have to respond to my questions, but respond to anything you've heard on the panel, but just a couple of things that pique my interest. I mean, firstly, Caitlin, I'd like to think about this idea that rape is becoming part of everyday life. And I think that's a very interesting claim, because do you recognise the risk that I think Ian hinted at, and one which I think I picked up on in doing some work on this topic, that if you see rape as part of everyday life, you detract from how serious rape is and how egregious it is. Do you see that as a risk of the rape culture position? And then for Christina, I'm interested in the word propaganda, because my instinct is to ask, well, propaganda for what? What's the cause? Ian, anything you want to come back on?
Yes, there is a bit, actually. And I'm going to put it sort of delicately. I mean, it's this stuff around, sort of rough sex and, and is there ever a context in which, rape porn, for instance, and all of this sort of cultural detritus around the issue. And I think that's part of a broader thing that it's always very, very difficult for us to talk about. But you see it, for instance, in the romance novel. So this is a very broad cultural trend of male power and male domination in sex. But, the romance novels read for hundreds of years always has the woman being seduced. So the man is taking on the active role of trying to get her to accept sex. In action films, you will never see a situation in which the two love interests are interested enough in each other at the beginning. Always the woman is resistant to the man at the beginning, and by the end of the film, the man has gotten her down to the point where he would talk. There is, and of course, my other job is with the erotic review, so we get sent a lot of sort of usually quite terrible sort of sexual stories. And I would say easily, among men and women, the most common sexual fancy is the male power fancy. It is not the only one. It's sort of like McDonald's. It's fine, but if you have it every single day, it's going to do your head in. But it is extremely common. And if we start saying that is just a fantasy that men have and not that women have, for instance, we get ourselves into the position where, this is going to be considered unacceptable. I thought the ban on rape porn was utterly disgraceful because it takes away women's consent. There was no claim that these were real rape videos. We already have laws against that stuff. This is about two people deciding that they want to shoot something. It's also about a husband and wife who choose to film themselves acting out sexual fantasies in the bedroom. The sexual fantasy is legal, but the video that is produced is illegal. And on the further end of that, we then see the criminalization of the BDSM community, which has happened again because of this impression that all sort of demonstrations of male sort of dominance in a sexual situation is necessarily removing the consent from the woman or is somehow dangerous or somehow encouraging rape in society. I don't accept any of those premises. The only thing that encourages rape in society is the prevalence of bastards and the lack of sex education that we have. So I think we need to be quite careful when we address these sort of topics to make sure that we don't start taking away applying our real-world rules to the fantasy world, which looks nothing like the real world, and nor should it.
Great, thanks. Caitlin?
Yeah, sorry, just repeat your question.
Oh, my question, it was about whether or not the idea that rape is part of everyday life actually ends up detracting from how seriously we take rape and sexual assault and violence.
I don't think so. I mean, maybe just kind of the comment I would say to respond to that is Jessica Valenti popularized this term, women live on a rape schedule. So we're kind of constantly aware that at any point, in theory, we could be raped. So this is where women walk with keys between our fingers at night, or we take certain precautions like making sure that you watch your drink or your friend watches your drink in case it gets spiked. I don't necessarily think that it means that, because we're aware that rape can happen, the stranger rape, I don't think it necessarily means that rape isn't taken as seriously.
Okay. Sue?
Well, 2 points. I suppose I owe half an apology to you, Ian, because you did make some good points about consent, but I just want to come back on the issue that as far as the law is concerned, consent is a very complex and a very difficult notion to negotiate in the courts. And historically, what is consent? I mean, what is consent? Consent is something that you do freely and you do of your total and own volition. And when I talk to students about consent, I say to my students, I don't think there is ever an occasion when I have said about anything in my life that I have truly consented. I'm trying to get the point across that we assent in our jobs, in our work, in everything we do to that encounter. So the notion that consent is something easy for the courts to deal with or for us to deal with. And we are in situations of subordination Not always women, it can be men that are in situations of subordination, which mean that they assent because of economic, because of pressure, because of power, because of status, all kinds of issues. So the whole issue of consent, I think, is a very, very, very tricky one. And it's a tricky one for us in everyday life, and it's a very tricky one in the courts. And the narrative that you talk about, the BSM narrative, I mean, if people freely enter into a BSM situation, a situation of violence within their sexual encounter, that is fine. But it's going to be very difficult to actually distinguish those real consent issues from those where there is an issue of power. That narrative is coming more into the courtroom. Some of you will know about the Brown case in 1992 that went to the House of Lords, where there were men who indulged in sadomasochistic practices, which involved slicing skin off each other's penises, nailing scrotum to a board. I'm sorry, this is very early in the morning.
Sunday morning.
That was that factual narrative of the situation, and they all said they consented. And of course, one doesn't want to hunt and haunt any particular community that says we want to indulge in this kind of practice, but there were real concerns about whether some of those men actually really consented. That's my concern. We have a narrative now that is a much more popular narrative within the courts and within culture, from rough sex to sexual violence, and the argument is that the one who is the victim is actually consenting. And what I'm saying is, no, it's much more complex, and the courts are having difficulty in dealing with that, and we shouldn't trivialise the whole notion of consent.
Great, thank you, Sue. And Christina, anything you want to come back on?
You asked about the propaganda. I said before about these different theories of feminism, and I consider myself an egalitarian feminist. Sometimes I say equity feminist or freedom feminist. A freedom feminist is someone who wants for women what she wants for everyone, equal dignity and respect and freedom. But there was another school of feminism, which in my writings I've called gender feminism. And a gender feminist, it's short for the sex-gender system. They believe that women and men, but women bear the burden of this sex-gender system, that every institution in the society bears the impress of patriarchy, and it all must be interrogated to uncover these hidden, power dynamics in which women are held down. And there was one sex-gender feminist, Sandra Lee Bartke, a feminist philosopher, and she defined it. She said, we're all born bisexual, and then through socialization we're transformed into male and female human beings, one destined to command, the other to obey. I remember telling that to my husband, and he said, which commands, which obeys? But never mind. We're all destined. So there are women that believe that women have been initiated into this system where we are subordinate. And they will not give it up. The fact that women are now better educated than men, that women are in so many areas doing better and living longer for sure, and yet they still want to describe themselves as a victim class. We have colleges where women are approaching 60%, 64%, and they still have a women's center because women are held back and oppressed. I don't understand that. But because of that theory about the sex-gender system and these invisible forces, they needed the smoking gun. They needed data. So they eagerly grabbed on to these methodologies where you could suddenly find a hidden epidemic of predation, a hidden epidemic. 1 in 3 women battered, 1 in 4 victims of sexual assault. Naomi Wolf, at the height of this, which I thought was the height of it, but it seems to be coming back, in her book, The Beauty Myth, she said 150,000 women are dying every year from anorexia nervosa, a disease caused not by nature but by men. Those were her words. And there aren't 150,000 women dying of it. I mean, it was someone misread a brochure. I think they confused people that were suffering from eating disorders with annual deaths. I don't know, but it was an out of control piece of propaganda. Everyone grabbed onto it, and it became part. It was repeated along with these others. It's a kind of victim catechism. And it bothers me as a college professor. I see young women, they come into a college classroom, they're idealistic, they want to improve the world, and then they have professors, and in their textbooks, they read these victim statistics. They're actually hate statistics because they do engender anger. And you take beautiful young women and turn them into bitter, suspicious creatures who don't trust men and who want to see the worst in men. And will take the worst case sociopathic male, and suddenly an Elliot Rodgers becomes emblematic for the male sex. These are the results of the propaganda. So I think maybe first was the theory, and then they looked for the facts.
Thank you, Christina. Okay, audience, hands go up. Okay.
Thank you for the debate, and also thank you for making it so civilised, because these debates often are not civilised.
There's still time.
And I think I've been following these debates for quite a while, and they get very emotional very often. But what really interests me is how each side, if that's the right word to use, would define what the debate's about. Is it about prevalence? Is it about the validity of statistics? Is it about, for example, whether the true number of women raped is 1 in 5 or 1 in 50? Or is it about the importance of these things in the wider context? Because when you notice these debates, what you find is that very often people agree on the facts, but they have very different emotional reactions to those facts. And one very interesting question is what underlies the different emotional reactions? You know, some people are accused of just dismissing the concerns of the other side accused the first side of dismissing their concerns. How do you really, if you want to be analytical about this, how do you really get to the bottom of what's going on? And then I suppose there are questions about the extent to which terms like rape are understood. Whether, for example, we say that rape is understood in a simple legal sense, sex without consent, or do we understand consent to be something much bigger? You know, you've got to consent truly, you've got to be in a free society where genders are equal and so on. So I suppose my interest is really to all sides. How is this, what's the debate really about?
I guess I'd like to interrogate the whole notion of the idea of rape culture, because it seems to me that if you say we live in a rape culture in the West, this is a complete travesty of what's actually happening to women in other parts of the world. I mean, look at the way Islamic State is treating women. That's rape culture. That's an unabashed celebration of criminality against women in the most, unimaginable way. I don't believe Susan Brown Miller, when she wrote Against Our Will, could have even imagined ISIS in the way it's behaving or is being reported as behaving. And it does seem to me there's a disconnect there, because actually I think women in the West are, comparatively speaking, incredibly free, incredibly privileged, and incredibly lucky. So perhaps we could interrogate that more.
I find this very frustrating in that I'm a student at university, and rape culture to me is walking from my home to the library any time of the day and someone catcalling, saying, hey, gorgeous, that, want to fuck, want to suck my cock? Sorry, by the way, I know it's early. And I say no, and they say, oh, you're a fat black bitch anyway. Okay, rape culture to me is when I spoke to a policeman, and he said, and I'm not even exaggerating, he said that women should not be surprised when these things happen if they've drank a bottle of wine before they go out at night, or they're wearing a short skirt. And Christina, I just want to say, I find it slightly ironic and amusing that you are, as a self-declared feminist, you use the term hysteria, given the historical connotations of that word, us women in our wandering wombs. And I just don't get why there is such this backlash against this culture, which, I'm sorry, it's real. I've spoken to my fellow students. It is a thing that happens, and I don't understand why there is such a backlash, why there's such a push against trying to raise awareness. And also, raising awareness does not trivialise the severity and the crime of what rape is. If anything, it gives people more strength to talk about it and recognise that it's really wrong.
Well, I think trivialization and panic are just two ends of the scales, and probably how we respond is the extent we ourselves as person are touched by the subject. Is that if someone is touched daily by it, it goes more into paranoia or panic. But if someone just looks at it from the outside and personally have never experienced that horror, that goes into trivialization. And the question of consent or no consent, because that's the other, I think, most important factor, if it actually exists, is there's the question if we can actually look for the reasons. Because what we are normally looking at in a case is a present moment, and we never look at the reasons. So what I don't see, for example, is a representation of a psychotherapist here who would tell that most people who commit abuse or who are victim of abuse. They are highly traumatized people.
Just a quick question on the statistics to start off with. So it's been said repeatedly on the panel that the same proportion of conviction rates are taking place now as they were back in the 1970s. I'm not a lawyer, I don't understand all the statistics or know all the statistics on this, but my understanding is that there are an awful lot more cases coming to court than there were in the 1970s. So if the proportion is remaining the same, but more cases are coming to court, then that means in numerical terms there are an awful lot more rape convictions taking place now than there were in the 1970s. It also suggests to me that there's a lot of convictions being put before courts that there's just no evidence, that there's not enough evidence to convict them. So that's the first point. I would just like to pose that as a question. Second thing kind of makes me quite angry. I've heard an awful lot about all women on the panel this morning. So all women feel pressured to respond to male entitlement. All women live on a rape schedule. All women do not enjoy rough sex. I'm kind of like, who are you people to speak on behalf of all women? Sorry, but unless you've actually been around and asked all women, you cannot do that. And all that this does is it promotes this fear, this panic. So the thing that alarmed me most, having a 9-year-old daughter and hearing you say, Sue, you know, we should worry about our daughters. Well, I do worry about my daughter. What I worry about is that she's going to become imbued with this absolute panic. And it's that complete disjuncture between what I'm hearing and the real world that people live in. I work on a university. It's absolutely bizarre to think that women are being catcalled on a university campus. You know, as people walk from the library to their bedrooms, this just does not happen. This is not reality the way that most people experience their lives. I think, unfortunately, Christina, one problem with what you said, there are victims of this rape culture. I actually think the biggest victims of this rape culture, though, are not the poor men, and I agree with you, there are men who get falsely accused. I think the biggest victims of this rape culture panic are women, because I speak to women on universities who do believe that they are too scared to leave their bedrooms because they will be raped walking from their bedrooms to the library. That is not going to happen. That is so completely untrue. And yet they have been imbued with this fear that they dare not leave their bedrooms after dark. And I think that is shocking. And I think that women who are going around perpetrating this panic, making women too scared to leave their bedrooms, really have an awful lot to feel responsible for.
Correct.
I just wanted to ask what the solution is to these problems. We've heard about the statistics and the misrepresentation of truth and the politics and the multi-million-pound industry behind it. What is the solution?
I think part of the problem is that the use of the word rape is very wide, and it's much more nuanced. It's much more nuanced than that. There are lots of rape in war is an act of violence. When we're talking about people who are out on a night out and have had too much to drink and things get out of hand, I don't think that's the same thing. And I think when you lump everything together, you can get very confused. And that confusion leads to panic.
I've got a question for everyone on the panel, particularly for Sue. At one point, I believe that you said that you've never fully, freely consented to anything in your life. If that's the case, then it seems to me that under your own sort of definition, that any man who's ever had sex with you has raped you. And a question that I would like to further ask is if you take the view that women can't consent, what problems does this have for the legal situation in general? And moreover, my understanding of some feminist philosophy is that that the whole legal system is deemed by some feminists to be set up by a patriarchal society in favour of men, and this is why men are not being convicted, that women are not being believed in courts. And it seems to me that they want to change, or potentially change, the whole basis of innocent until proven guilty, to guilty unless proven innocent, that the starting point should not be that the accused is innocent, but that the woman is believed. And I wonder if any people on the panel can comment on this.
I wanted to go back to a point that was raised during the consent session yesterday, which I think Luke raised it, which is he said that he thinks that what we have is a problem not with sex, but a problem with intimacy. And in my own research, I've gone and I've read accounts of rape accusations on American college campuses now, and you read them, and some of them clearly are sexual assaults. I think most people would agree, but a lot of them are just bad sex. I felt manipulated. He was mean to me, and a lot of them are sort of retrospectively reimagined as I've been raped. And I guess the thing I wanted to raise is that I think part of the problem and why this is more current now is I think the current generation of students have a real problem with risk. And I think that risk is inherent in intimacy. You always take a risk when you become intimate with somebody. And the reality is that, sometimes it's not going to work out. So, in some ways, the definition of college sex is that it's bad sex because you're taking risks, and it's not always, beautiful or, ongoing or, so it seems to me that perhaps it's that reluctance to take a risk. And just the last thing is, it's very different because for my generation, we had a lot of bad sex, and we took risks. And but the thing is that taking risks is an adult thing to do. It's part of becoming an adult. And so, even though you had bad experiences along the way, they were experiences that you willingly entered into as an adult, and that was exhilarating. And I just find it a very different mindset.
I think we do live in a rape culture, and I wanted to comment that saying that other countries it's worse, we're actually better off. That doesn't mean things are good here. If a rape happens anywhere, it's bad. And I think that goes with the numbers. Do the numbers really matter? 1 in 5, 1 in 50, it's still bad. And also, I'm surprised that none of the people really touched upon on males being the victims. And, you've got with sort of prison rape jokes. How many times have people heard, oh, don't drop the soap? And it's seen as funny, and it's not seen as sort of as serious as a woman being raped. And it is rape. There's also like fraping with Facebook. Should that word be used in such a trivial sense? So we need to define what rape is, define how we can sort out when consent does become blurred. And also, I know Ian mentioned that consent classes weren't the answer, but you mentioned that sex education was important. Well, what about starting teaching consent from a very young age? Forget about sexual consent, teach it with intimate consent, relate, general consent to be a decent human being. And I did disagree with the thing that you've got to, it's the bastard you're looking out for, whereas actually I think everyone can be a victim of not understanding how to be intimate.
I think you just need to look at what's happening in the press with Jana, Proctor and Britain to see what the establishment does to cover up child abuse and consent issues. It defends its own. These are powerful people. They use the words, like these poor old men, lurid, unspeakable allegations that, almost say more about the people claiming them than they do the actual assault itself. I see this written in Spiked. I see this in the Times regularly, and I hear it from various people in this room. And I've had enough of it. It's disgusting. We need access to justice. That's the way you're going to control this so-called mob.
I'm going to come back to the panel, and I'm going to take it in reverse order if I can. Christina, is there anything you want to come back on?
So many things. Okay. The first thing I'll say is this whole idea of consent and then regulating that in law courts is so misguided because it is metaphysically impossible to know what goes on between two people when there are no witnesses. And even if she did, I say she, it could be he, but even if she did consent, she can withdraw the consent. And that would matter. And in some cases, that could be an attack. We don't know. So we have these he said, she said cases. And now in the United States, what's happened is they've brought in this yes means yes and these consent laws and the lowest standard of proof on campus, a preponderance of evidence rather than beyond a reasonable doubt or, you can be found guilty. Now, a young man typically will be found guilty on this very low standard. If there's more than a 50% chance he did it, and then you add that to this view that some have that women don't lie about rape, which they do, not because they're women, because they're human, and people lie, especially about sex, but never mind that. We've got these courts and this terrible injustice, and then this idea that we can regulate this unhappiness and this misery, we can regulate it out of our lives. You can't. You have to try your best, and you have to try your best to limit, to protect women and men from victimization while not becoming a police state and with respect for the due process. And it's almost as if in these discussions people forget that. They think, well, this, and I think it's because of the theories and they think it's an epidemic out of control. All women live on a rape schedule. I don't even know what that means. And the men in this room are far more likely to be beaten up and murdered than women. And do they live on a murder schedule? Do they live, what does that even mean? So I just this language, and when we were free, fortunate people in a society where no one can be 100% safe, but we're safer than almost anybody in history. And certainly women are more self-determining today. And then finally, I'll say, again, going back to what you were talking about earlier, I think about those sorts of books that women like. It's not men who buy these bodice rippers and romance novels. It's women. It's women who bought 50 Shades of Grey. And so that's the sexual imagination. And you don't want to police that either. So I do see this as a repressive movement, and I urge you, if you've been taken in by it, is to read a little more. And then when someone asked about solutions, I think there are two issues. We need a solution. We're never going to have an absolute solution to crime, to violent crime and horrible crime. We have to do our best in the ways that I said before. But I think about the rape culture, the fact that it doesn't exist. The solution is that we need more diversity, intellectual diversity on our campuses. And the skeptics, like myself, we were silenced. And the women's movement talks about, women's voices being silenced. Yeah, by a lot of feminists. So if you're a dissident feminist, and I just wish that when young women come into their freshman classes, in my ideal university, there would be radical feminists. I think we can learn. I have learned from radical feminists. Even Catherine McKinnon is a brilliant woman. I just disagree with 90% of what she says, but there's 10% that I find engaging and interesting. So she can have a place, but then I want the counterpoise, and I want someone who's reality-based to counter her. And you haven't had that. And I'm telling you with all the sincerity I can muster, if you believe you live in a rape culture, you need, this sounds rude, but a little deprogramming. This is not true. It's not a reality.